Okay, hi everyone. If we are on live right now, I'm here with my friend and colleague Rene, and today we're going to talk about trauma. We decided to do this about once a week, and we are tackling this very important topic today, so generalizable to so many people, right, Rene?
Absolutely. Nicholas, I'm so excited for this particular discussion, and we have a lot to cover, a couple of questions we can cover. So I'm so excited. Let's get into it.
Yeah, let's get into it for sure. So, where shall we start? Where do you think we should start?
I think the best place to start is from the beginning, understanding this term trauma that
Mhm.
is talked around. What is the right definition of trauma, Nicholas? What do you think?
Oh, what is the right definition of trauma? In my field, and especially in the counseling world, we never approach issues in terms of right and wrong. In fact, we call that black and white thinking. So
Yeah.
I want to rephrase this question, in terms of not what is right or wrong definition of trauma, but what is a useful definition of trauma. So if I think of a useful definition of trauma, I find very useful the understanding that trauma is these two things. One, trauma is a present state, not a past state. Most people associate trauma with a memory, with something that happened in the past. But
Yeah.
actually, trauma is a living state. And so trauma is happening in you right now. And the reason why it's happening in you right now is because your body is in a state of hyperactivation. So in the past, you went through an event that was dramatic for you in particular,
Yeah.
and your fight and flight system got activated. Now,
Yeah.
normally, let's say after you fall off a wall that is 3 meters high, you have a little shock, you're all panicked, your fight and flight system goes on. But once you've checked your body, 2, 3 minutes later, your breathing comes down, your heart rate comes down, and everything is okay, right?
Absolutely.
When that heart rate stays up and that breathing stays a bit shallow, and your brain stays in that, I need to fight this thing or I need to flee away right now kind of state, and it goes unconscious,
Yeah.
after 6 months, technically, that becomes trauma. Another reason
Mm-hmm.
why we cannot say this is the right definition of trauma, the wrong definition of trauma, is that what is traumatic for you as an event may not be traumatic to me. Even things
Absolutely.
like cataclysmic event like an earthquake, a tsunami, the death of a family member, everybody will react differently. A lot of
Yeah.
people who went through, for example, September 11, came out of traumas that they haven't even healed to this day. But the majority has healed, and not everybody came out with that kind of traumatic state. So, first and foremost, trauma is a living state. And then the second thing is trauma lives in the body. It's not just a thing that is confined to your head, but it's a thing that lives in your body, in the sense that it is your body that has a higher beat rate, a shallower um, breathing, a tighter digestive system. And so all your organs and your muscles are stressed. That's what trauma is essentially. It's a state of stress. So your body is going to be stressed, and together with your mind and your nervous system, your whole system is in stress. How does that make sense for you?
Now, that's a good question. Thank you for bringing that up. And let me just be share from my experience and my background.
Sure.
Me being here, how we view our systems. When you say systems, for us in this culture, is that we see ourselves as part of a group.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I'm sure you've heard of this concept called Ubuntu. I am because we are,
Right,
and
right.
we are
Rene, you might want to tell us where you're from, in particular, a beautiful country of.
absolutely. Absolutely. I'm in the country of Kenya in East
Right,
Africa. Yeah.
right.
So in this African setup, in this East African setup, I could actually really relate with anyone who is from also from the Eastern cultures. Um, we find identity as a group. I am because we are because I am. So when you say systems, and it's great how you brought up the example of 9/11, and that not everyone experienced the trauma the same way, and that's how we are. If the majority didn't experience the trauma the same way, then I feel I shouldn't feel that way. That's where I'm coming from, Nicholas, and I'm trying to understand so that when we see
Um,
it as a group, Nicholas, I'm seeing it as a group. If the majority do not feel that the kind of trauma that I'm feeling, is it valid? I have that kind of dilemma with myself from that identity.
Look, I think there are two very important things that you're getting into right now, and I'm not sure it touches so much on the questions that are here in front of us. Probably, if it does, it touches on the what are the trauma causes? What are the causes of trauma, right?
Absolutely.
So relationships are a protective mechanism for trauma.
Yeah.
So normally speaking, a group will be much more resilient towards a shared experience of trauma, such as, you know, the Jews in the Holocaust,
Absolutely.
um, Black Americans in the United
Yeah.
States, the Native Americans of North America, or the Native Aboriginals of Australia.
Yeah.
These are groups that have suffered tremendously as a collective, right?
Yeah.
And as a collective, they still pay the price of
Yeah.
those events.
Yeah.
So, at a certain level, many of the individuals that form these groups are traumatized because intergenerationally, from generation to the generation, this trauma is passed down collectively, like right from two parents. You have one child and then another child and another child, and all these children are receiving, well, not only the environmental conditions that are a result of, these brutal acts of violence that happened, um, but also just behaviorally, maybe oftentimes, let's say I know a little bit more about Native Aboriginals. Oftentimes, um, a classical Native Aboriginal family will have an alcoholic in the family,
Yeah.
and we'll have another person who is severely abused, often sexually abused, physically abused. So they grow up in this environment, and so violence is a very natural part of their environment. So as a group, as an individual, it then becomes very, very hard to extract yourself from the group.
Yeah.
Yeah. In individualistic countries where there is a bit more space between people in terms of how they identify each other, an event like September 11, although let's face it, September 11 was just one event. The invasion of North America, Nazism was so many events, repeatedly over long periods of time. So that's a very different scenario. We'll talk about it in a moment, if you like. Um, but individual cultures, you could say individuals have more freedom of psychological movement in a way,
Absolutely.
right? Less mutual identification. And so there might be space for more individuals to remain unaffected in a way. And in that case, if fewer individuals are affected, then you would want the group to be a reparatory sort of mechanism, right? But the
Yeah.
problem is then in the individualistic cultures, the group is not really a protection system for the individual because it is an individualistic culture.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this kind of touches on the causes of trauma at some level, but at a very broad, generalized level. It's difficult, I think, for individuals, unless they are part of those collectives, to perhaps understand what we're talking about right now. But extremely interesting question. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. In fact, you've just touched on what are the trauma causes. And that's one of the questions we have there. I think since you mentioned it, can we just cover what are the trauma causes?
Um, it's a little bit like the question of what is right and what is wrong, because as I've said before, we process. events around us very differently. And also, we are born with innate differences in how sensitive to the environment we are,
Yeah.
right? Um, so, what is a cause of trauma? What is a cause of that brings your body and mind into this high alert state, this high stress state? For you is not the same for me. We can say that all the causes of trauma trigger the body and the mind into the fight and flight state.
Yeah.
And then it triggers that to remain constant over a period of time longer than 6 months. Now, is it an earthquake? Is it you being left in a shopping center for too long when you were too small to understand that you were not being abandoned? The mom was just going around the shopping center to get something. Is it a suicide in your family? Is it um, a parent never touching you in a proper way? You know, like hugging you and having physical contact with you. All of these are trauma causes from the most typical and classical. So yeah, I speak of classical trauma causes of trauma and non-classical causes of trauma. The classical ones are the images that we get immediately in our minds when we think of trauma. You know, September 11, um, earthquakes, tsunamis, these kind of big shock events, natural event or man-made events, but they're big. Like for example, I know a few days ago, there was a shooting in Sydney. Certainly some people will come out of that with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, right? um, so those are man-made, but they're shocks, and they're very easy to recognize. The less easy to recognize ones are more like the ones that I just mentioned. You know, maybe a one event where you're left at home all alone at an age where you're not able to process that experience, or where you see, for example, a classical one is where your mother maybe is depressed and nobody notices it. And nobody notices is that she cannot give you the emotional attention that you expect as a baby child. You know, that turns on your nervous system in a way that is abnormal and in a way that will persevere for a long time. A lot of my clients may come to me with 20, 30 years on their back for a trauma that happened at that stage of their life, very early on in life, out of causes that many people don't associate with trauma.
It's interesting how you bring that up because I have a story
Huh?
on that maybe encompasses both because in my culture, what happened is the setting that I'm at in Kenya, there was a young man who went through a shock trauma, right? That his parents died, but also the following trauma was that what really was the biggest hurdle for him is that he wasn't able to give them a decent funeral. So that's kind of an encompassing of both, whereby the trauma cause in itself in that moment was that they've gone. I can't even have time to process that. I have to figure out how can I give them a decent funeral to honor the custom that we already really believe in this particular. So it was interesting to recognize that was what was his biggest hurdle, not even taking in what has just happened. So that's maybe also some kind of a trauma cause in itself because he wasn't able to give them a decent burial. So in that situation, the biggest trauma cause will be the after effect of how he was able to do it, and he had to do it alone. So the
Yeah. So
yeah,
I see we're going just over time right now. We'll have to close this live today. We're limiting it to 20 minutes, but I'd
yeah,
be very happy to pick up on this example that you brought up next
yeah.
week, and just to continue from there, so that we may cover the questions that are here on the board, and also illustrate with examples. So I want to thank you today, Rene, for joining me in this live. I look forward to next week. I want to thank everybody for watching, and see you next week.
See you next week. Thank you again, Nicholas.
Thank you.